Chapter 22. That evening, the wind from Isfahan carried a sharp perfume of apricot. But how lifeless were the streets! Khayyam took refuge in his observatory. Usually he only had to enter it, look at the sky, and feel in his fingers the graduated discs of the astrolabe in order for the worries of the world to vanish. Not this time. The stars were taciturn, there was no music, not a sound, no secrets. Umar did not rush them, for they had to have good reason for remaining silent. He decided to go home and walked slowly, holding a reed which sometimes hit against a tuft of grass or an unruly branch. He was now stretched out in his bedroom with the lights out. His arms desperately held an imaginary Jahan. His eyes were red from tears and wine. On the floor to his left were a carafe and a silver goblet, which he seized from time to time with a weary hand in order to take long, pensive draughts of disillusion. His lips held a dialogue with him, with Jahan, with Nizam, but above all with God. Who else could hold together this universe which was crumbling? It was not until dawn that an exhausted Umar, his head clouded, finally gave himself over to sleep. How many hours did he sleep? The sound of footsteps woke him up. The sun was already high, and pouring through a slit in the tenting forced him to shield his eyes. He was able to make out in the doorway the man whose noisy arrival had disturbed him. He was big and wore a mustache. His hand was tapping the sheath of his sword with a maternal gesture. His head was bound in a bright green turban, and on his shoulders was the short velvet cape of the officers of the Nizamiya. "Who are you?" Khayyam asked with a yawn. "Who gave you rights over my sleep?" "Has the master never seen me with Nizam al-Mulk? I was his bodyguard, his shadow. They call me Vartan the Armenian." Omar remembered now, and it hardly reassured him. He felt as if a cord were being knotted from his neck to his gut. However, if he was afraid, he did not want to show it. "His bodyguard and shadow, you say? So it was up to you to protect him from the assassin." "He had ordered me to stay away. Everyone knows that he wanted to die like that. I could have killed one murderer and another would have sprung up. Who am I to intercede between my master and his fate?" "And what do you want?" "Last night, our troops slipped into Isfahan. The garrison rallied to us. Sultan Barkiyarok has been rescued, and this city belongs to him from now on." Khayyam sat bolt upright. "Jahan!" It was a shout and an anguished question. Vartan said nothing. His worried air jarred with his marital bearing. Omar thought he could read in his eyes a monstrous admission. The officer muttered, "I really wanted to try and save her. I would have been so proud to present myself to the illustrious Khayyam, bringing to him his spouse unharmed. But I arrived too late. All the people of the palace had been massacred by the soldiers." Umar went toward the officer and punched him as hard as he could without even succeeding in shaking him. "And you have come here to tell me that?" The officer kept his hand on the sheath of his sword but had not drawn it. He spoke calmly. "I came for something else completely. The officers of the Nizamiya have decided that you must die. When you wound the lion, they say, it is wise to finish him off. I took on myself the task of putting you to death." Khayyam suddenly became calmer. He would keep his bearing up to the end. How many sages had devoted their whole life to reach this peak of the human condition? He did not plead for his life, but on the contrary, he felt his fear wane by the second, and he thought above all of Jahan. He had no doubt that she too had kept her bearing. "I would never have pardoned those who killed my wife. My whole life I would have been their enemy, and my whole life I would have dreamed of seeing them impaled. You are absolutely right to rid yourselves of me." "It is not my opinion, master. It was up to 5 officers to decide your fate. My companions all wanted your death, and I was the only one to oppose it." "You were wrong. Your companions seem to be wiser." "I often saw you with Nizam al-Mulk. You were sitting down, conversing like father and son. He never stopped loving you in spite of your wife's schemes. If he were here with us, he would not have condemned you. He would also have forgiven her for your sake." Khayyam took a close, hard look at his visitor, as if he had just now discovered his presence. "If you were against my death, why did they choose you to come and execute me?" "It was I who offered myself. The others would have killed you, but I planned to leave you alive. Otherwise, why would I have stayed talking with you?" "And how will you explain this to your companions?" "I will not explain anything. I shall go away. I shall follow you." You announced it so calmly, as if it were a long-standing decision. "It is the very truth. I do not act impulsively. I was the most faithful servant of Nizam al-Mulk. I believed in him. If God had allowed it, I would have died to protect him. However, long ago I decided that if the master should disappear, I would serve neither his sons nor his successors, and I would forever give up the profession of the sword. The circumstances of his death have forced me to use it one last time. I was involved in the murder of Malik Shah, and I do not regret it. He had betrayed his tutor, his father, the man who raised him up to the summit. He thus deserved to die. I had to kill, but that has not made me a killer. I would never have shed the blood of a woman, and when my companions outlawed Khayyam, I understood that the time had come for me to leave, to change my life, and to become a hermit or a wandering poet. If you want, master, collect some belongings, and we shall leave this city as soon as possible." "To go where?" "We shall take whatever path you wish. I shall follow you everywhere as a disciple, and my sword will protect you. We will be able to return when the tumult has died down." While the officer was ready in the mounts, Umar hurriedly gathered up his manuscript, his writing case, his flask, and a purse bulging with gold. They rode right through the oasis of Isfahan to the suburb of Marbain, toward the west, without being troubled by the numerous soldiers. One word from Vartan was enough for the gates to be opened and the guards to stand aside respectfully. The servility shown to Vartan did not fail to intrigue Omar, who nevertheless avoided questioning his companion. For the moment, he had no choice other than to trust him. They had been gone less than an hour before a seething crowd came to pillage Khayyam's house and set it on fire. By the end of the afternoon, the observatory had been laid waste. At the same moment, the lifeless body of Jahan was interred at the foot of the mulberry tree which bordered the palace garden. There would be no tombstone to show posterity her place of burial. A parable from the Samarkand manuscript. 3 friends were taking a walk on the high plateaus of Persia. A panther sprang out at them with all the fierceness in the world. The panther looked at the 3 men for a long time and then ran toward them. The first was the oldest, the richest, and the most powerful. He cried out, "I am the master of these districts. I shall never allow a beast to ravage the lands which belong to me." He had with him 2 hunting dogs and set them onto the panther. They managed to bite it, but the panther only became stronger, overwhelmed them, jumped on their master, and ripped out his intestines. Thus was the fate of Nizam al-Mulk. The second man wondered, "I am a man of knowledge. Everyone honors and respects me. Why should my fate be decided by dogs and a panther?" He turned tail and fled without waiting for the outcome of the fight. Since then, he has wandered from cave to cave, from hut to hut, convinced that the wild beast was always at his heels. Thus was the fate of Omar Khayyam. The third was a man of belief. He walked toward the panther with his hands open, with a dominating demeanor and eloquent words. "You are welcome to these lands," he said to the panther. "My companions were richer than I, and you despoiled them. They were prouder than I, and you have laid them low." The beast listened, seduced and subdued. The man had the advantage over the panther and managed to train it. Since then, no panther has dared to approach him, and men keep away. The manuscript concludes, when the time of upheavals arrived, no one could stop its course, no one could flee, but some managed to use it. Hassan Sabbah, more than anyone, knew how to tame the ferocity of the world. He sowed fear all around him in order to make a tiny piece of calm for himself in his redoubt of Al-Maut. No sooner had he gained control of the fortress than Hassan Sabbah undertook actions to assure that he was sealed off from any contact with the outside world. His first priority was to render impossible any enemy penetration. With the help of some clever building, he thus improved the already exceptional quality of the site by blocking off the slightest passageway between two hills. However, these fortifications were not enough for Hassan. Even if an assault was impossible, the besiegers would still hope to starve him out or cut off his water. It is thus that most sieges end, and it was on this point that Al-Maut was particularly vulnerable, having only meager stocks of drinking water. The Grand Master found the answer. Instead of drawing his water from the neighboring rivers, he had an impressive network of cisterns and canals dug in the mountain to collect rainwater and the melting snows. The visitor to the ruins of the castle today can still admire, in the large room where Hassan lived, a magic basin which filled itself up with as much water as was taken out from it, and which, by a stroke of ingenuity, never overflowed. For provisions, the Grand Master had storage shafts fitted out for oil, vinegar, and honey. He also stockpiled barley, sheep fat, and dried fruit in sufficient quantities to get them through an almost total blockade, which at that time was far beyond the capacity of any besiegers, particularly in a region which had a harsh winter. Hassan thus had an infallible shield. He had, one could say, the ultimate defensive weapon. With his devoted killers, he also possessed the ultimate offensive weapon. How can precautions be taken against a man intent on dying? All protection is based upon dissuasion, and we know that important personages are surrounded by an imposing guard whose role is to make any potential attacker fear inevitable death. But what if the attacker is not afraid of dying and has been convinced that martyrdom is a shortcut to paradise? What if he has imprinted in his mind the words of the preacher, "You are not made for this world, but for the next"? Can a fish be afraid if someone threatens to throw it into the sea? If, moreover, the assassin had succeeded in infiltrating the victim's entourage, nothing could be done to stop him. "I am less powerful than the Sultan, but I can harm you more than he can," Hassan wrote one day to a provincial governor. Thus, having forged the most perfect tools for war imaginable, Hassan Sabbah installed himself in his fortress and never left it again. His biographers even say that during the last 30 years of his life, he only went out of his house twice, and both times it was to go up to the roof. Morning and evening he was there, sitting cross-legged on a mat which his body had worn out, but which he never wished to change or have repaired. He taught, he wrote, he set his killers on to his enemies, and 5 times a day he prayed on the same mat along with whoever was visiting him at that time. For the benefit of those who have never had the opportunity to visit the ruins of Al-Maut, it is worth pointing out that this site would not have acquired such historical importance if its only advantage had been its inaccessibility, and if the plateau at the mountain summit had not been large enough to support a town, or at least a very large village. At the time of the assassins, it was reached by a narrow tunnel to the east, which emerged into the lower fortress with its tangle of alleys and little mud houses in the shadow of the walls. The upper fortress was reached by crossing the Maidan, the large square, the only meeting area for the whole community. This was shaped like a bottle lying on its side, with its wide base in the east and its neck toward the west. The bottleneck itself was a heavily guarded corridor at the end of which lay Hassan's house, whose single window looked out onto a precipice. It was a fortress within a fortress. By means of the spectacular murders which he had ordered, and the legends which grew up around him, his sect and his castle, the Grand Master of the assassins terrorized the Orient and the Occident over a long period. In every Muslim town, high officials fell, and even the Crusaders had 2 or 3 eminent victims to lament. However, it is all too often forgotten that it was primarily at Al-Maut that terror reigned. What reign is worse than that of militant virtue? The supreme preacher wanted to regulate every second of his adherents' lives. He proscribed all musical instruments. If he discovered the smallest flute, he would break it in public and throw it into the flames. The transgressor was put in irons and given a good whipping before being expelled from the community. The use of alcoholic drinks was even more severely punished. Hassan's own son, found intoxicated one evening by his father, was condemned to death on the spot. In spite of his mother's pleadings, he was decapitated at dawn the next day as an example. No one ever dared to swallow a mouthful of wine. The justice of Al-Maut was, to say the least, speedy. It was said that a crime had been committed one day within the fortress and that a witness had accused Hassan's second son. Without attempting to verify the fact, Hassan had his last son's head cut off. A few days later, the real culprit confessed. He in turn was decapitated. Biographers of the Grand Master mention the slaughter of his son in order to illustrate his strictness and impartiality. They point out that the community of Al-Maut became a haven of virtue and morality through the blessing of such exemplary discipline, and this can very easily be believed. However, we know from various sources that the day after these executions, Hassan's only wife, as well as his daughters, rose up against his authority, and that he ordered them thrown out of Al-Maut and recommended that his successors do the same in the future in order to avoid the women folk having any influence of their correct judgment. To lose himself from the world, create a void around his person, surround himself with the walls of stone and fear, such seems to have been Hassan Sabbah's demented dream. However, this void started to stifle him. The most powerful kings have jesters or jovial companions to lighten the oppressive atmosphere which surrounds them. The man with the bulging eyes was incurably alone, walled up in his fortress, shut up in his house, closed to himself. He had no one to talk to, only docile subjects, dumb servants, and awe-struck disciples. Of all the people he had known, there was only one to whom he could still talk, if not as friend to friend, then at least as man to man, and that was Khayyam. He had thus written him a letter in which despair disguised itself behind a thick facade of pride. Instead of living as a fugitive, why do you not come to Al-Maut? Like you, I have been persecuted, but now it is I who persecute. Here you will be protected, looked after, and respected. No emir on earth will be able to harm a hair on your head. I have founded a huge library where you will find the rarest works and will be able to read and write at leisure. In this place you will find peace. Chapter 23. Since he had left Isfahan, Khayyam had been leading effectively the existence of a fugitive and a pariah. When he betook himself to Baghdad, the Caliph forbade him to speak in public or to receive his numerous admirers who presented themselves at his door. When he visited Mecca, his detractors sniggered, a pilgrimage of servility. When on his return he passed through Basra, the sons of the Qadi of the city came to ask him, in the politest of terms, to cut short his stay. His fate then was unsettling in the extreme. No one contested his genius or his erudition. Wherever he went, large groups of intellectuals gathered around him. He was questioned on astrology, algebra, medicine, and even religious problems, and he was listened to warmly. However, without fail, a few days or weeks after his arrival, a clique would emerge and would disseminate all sorts of lies. He would be called an infidel or a heretic, and his friendship with Hassan Sabbah would be recalled. Sometimes the accusations of being an alchemist raised against him of old in Samarkand were dredged up. Ardent opponents were sent to break up his discussions, and those who dared shelter him were threatened with reprisals. Usually, he put up no opposition. As soon as he felt the atmosphere become uncomfortable, he would feign illness in order not to appear in public again, and he would then not linger, but would go away to somewhere new where his stay would be just as short and precarious. Honored and cursed, with no companion other than Vartan, he was constantly in search of a roof, a protector, and a patron too. The generous pension which Nizam had allotted to him was no longer being paid out since his death, and he was forced to visit princes and governors and prepare their monthly horoscopes. However, even though he was often in need, he managed to get himself paid without bowing his head. It was told that a vizier, astonished to hear Umar demand a sum of 5,000 golden dinars, remarked, "Do you know that I myself am not paid that much?" "That is quite normal," retorted Khayyam. "And how so?" "Because there's only a handful of intellectuals like me every century, while one could name 500 viziers like you every year." The chroniclers state that the man found this extremely amusing and went on to satisfy Khayyam's demands, courteously recognizing the correctness of such a haughty equation. "No sultan is happier than I, no beggar sadder," Umar wrote during this period. The years passed, and we find him again in 1114 in the city of Marwa, the capital of Khorasan, is still famous for its silks and its 10 libraries, but deprived for some time now of any political role. To restore some luster to its tarnished court, the local sovereign was trying to attract the celebrities of the time. He knew just how to seduce Khayyam by offering to build him an observatory identical to that of Isfahan. At 66 years of age, Umar no longer dreamt of anything else, and he accepted with adolescent enthusiasm and set right down to work on the project. Soon the building was rising up on a hilltop in the district of Bab Sinjan in the middle of a garden of daffodils and white mulberries. Umar was happy for 2 years, and he worked feverishly. We are told that he carried out astonishing experiments in weather forecasting, his knowledge of the sky allowing him to note exactly the changes of climate over 5 successive days. He also developed his mathematical theories, which were way ahead of his time. It was not until the 19th century that European researchers recognized him to be the brilliant precursor of non-Euclidean geometry. He also wrote rubayat, stimulated, we must believe, by the outstanding quality of Marwa's vineyards. For all that, there was evidently a negative side. Umar was obliged to be present at endless palace ceremonies and to pay homage solemnly to the sovereign at each feast. Whenever a prince was circumcised, upon the sovereign's return from the hunt or the country, and to be in frequent attendance in the diwan, ready to utter a witticism, a quotation, or a fitting verse. These sessions exhausted Umar, as well as the impression of having put on the skin of a performing bear. He was always aware of losing precious time at the palace, which he could have turned to better use at his work table, not to mention the risk of unpleasant encounters. Like the one which took place that cold February day when someone picked a memorable quarrel with him over a youthful quatrain which had fallen into jealous ears. That day the diwan was packed with beturbaned intellectuals, and the monarch was overjoyed as he blissfully contemplated his court. When Umar arrived, debate was already raging on a subject which fascinated the men of religion. Could the universe have been created better? Those who replied yes laid themselves open to accusation of impiety, since they implied that God had not taken sufficient care over his work. Those who replied no were also open to accusation of impiety, as they were given to understand that the Almighty was incapable of doing better. They were hot in discussion, with much gesticulating. Khayyam was happy absent-mindedly to watch everyone's expressions. However, a speaker called him, heaped praise upon his erudition, and asked for his opinion. Umar cleared his throat. He had not yet uttered a single syllable when the Grand Qadi of Marwa, who had never appreciated Khayyam's presence in his city, nor the considerations constantly shown to him, jumped up from his place and pointed an accusing finger at him. I did not know that an atheist could express opinions on the questions of our faith. Umar gave a tired but worried smile. Who gives you permission to treat me as an atheist? At least wait until you have heard me out. I have no need to hear you. Is it not you that this verse has been attributed? If you punish with evil the evil I have done, tell, what is the difference between you and me? Is not the man who puts forward such words an atheist? Umar shrugged. If I did not believe that God existed, I would not address him. But you would address him in that tone? Sniggered the Qadi. It is to sultans and qadis that one must speak with circumlocution, not to the Creator. God is great. He has nothing to do with our airs and graces. He made me a thinker, and so I think, and I give over to him the undiluted fruits of my thoughts. To murmurs of approval from those present, the Qadi withdrew, uttering dire threats. When he had stopped laughing, the sovereign was beset with worry, fearing the consequences in certain quarters. As his expression became gloomy, his visitors hurried to take their leave. As he returned home accompanied by Vartan, Umar inveighed against court life with its snares and time-wasting, promising himself that he would leave Marwa as soon as possible. His disciple was not too concerned, as it was the 7th time that his master had threatened to leave. As a rule, he was much calmer the next day, having taken up his research again, and that was the appropriate time to console him. That evening, back in his room, Umar wrote in his book a vexed quatrain which ended as follows: Swap your turban for some wine, and without regrets put on a woolen hat. Then he slipped the manuscript into its usual hiding place, between the bed and the wall. When he woke up, he wanted to reread the rubai since one word seemed to him out of place. He groped about and grasped the book. It was as he opened it that he discovered the letter from Hassan Sabah, which had been slipped between the 2 pages as he slept. In an instant, Umar recognized the writing and the nomenclature agreed upon between them 40 years earlier. The friend from caravanserai at Kashan. As he read it, he could not help bursting out laughing. Vartan, who was just waken up in his adjoining room, came in to see what was amusing his master so much after his ill feelings of the night before. We have just received a generous invitation. We can be lodged, protected, and have all our expenses looked after until the end of our lives. By which great prince? The Prince of Al-Maut. Vartan jumped. He felt guilty. How could the letter have got here? I checked all the doors and windows before I went to lie down. Do not try to find out. Sultans and Khalifs themselves have given up protecting themselves. When Hassan decides to send you a message or a dagger's blade, you can be certain of receiving it, whether your doors are wide open or padlocked. The disciple held the letter to his mustache, sniffed it noisily, and then read and reread it. That demon may well have a point, he concluded. It is indeed at Al-Maut that your safety would be best assured. After all, Hassan is your oldest friend. For the moment, my oldest friend is the new wine of Marwa. With childish glee, Umar set to tearing up the letter of paper into a multitude of little pieces which he threw up in the air. As he watched them flutter down, he started to speak again. What do we have in common, this man and I? I worship life and he worships death. I write, if you cannot love, what use is the rising and the setting of the sun? Hassan demands his men to give no heed to love, music, poetry, wine, or the sun. He despises the most beautiful things in all creation, yet he dares pronounce the name of the Creator and to promise people paradise. Believe you me, if his fortress were the gateway of paradise, I would renounce paradise. I shall never set foot in that den of pious shams. Vartan sat down and had a good scratch of his neck before saying, in the most exhausted of voices, If that is your response, then the time has come for me to reveal to you a secret which has been kept too long. Have you never wondered why the soldiers let us pass through so easily when we fled from Isfahan? It has always intrigued me, but since I have seen nothing but loyalty, devotion, and filial affection from you for years, I have not wished to stir up the past. That day, the officers of the Nizamiya knew that I was going to save you and leave with you. That was part of a strategy which I had drawn up. Before carrying on, he served his master and himself a useful glass of grenadine wine. You do know that the list of outlaws set up by Nizam al-Mulk contained the name of the man whom we had never managed to reach, Hassan Sabbah. Was he not the man principally responsible for the assassination? My plan was simple, to leave with you in the hope that you would take refuge in Al-Maut. I would have accompanied you, asking you not to reveal my identity, and I would have found an occasion to rid the Muslims and the entire world of that demon. However, you have stubbornly refused to set foot in the dark fortress. Yet you stayed by my side all this time. At the beginning, I thought I would just have to be patient and that when you had been chased out of 15 cities in succession, you would resign yourself to taking the road to Al-Maut. Then, as the years passed, I grew attached to you. My companions have been dispersed to the four corners of the empire and my determinations have wavered. See now how Umar Khayyam has saved Hassan Sabbah's life a second time. Do not bewail it. It may well be your life that I have saved. In truth, he must be very well protected in his hideout. Vartan could not suppress all traces of bitterness which amused Khayyam. Having said that, if you had revealed your plan to me, doubtless I would have led you to Al-Maut. The disciple jumped out of his seat. Is that the truth? No, sit yourself down. I only say that to give you cause for regret. In spite of all the evil Hassan has managed to commit, if I were to see him drowning in the river Murghab, I would offer him my hand in help. Well, I would shove his head down under the water. However, your attitude gives me some comfort, and it is just because you are capable of such words and acts that I chose to stay in your company, and I do not regret that. Khayyam gave his disciple a long hug. I am happy that my doubts about you have been dispelled. I am old now and need to know that I have a trusty man at my side because of the manuscript. That is the most precious thing I possess. In order to take on the world, Hassan Sabbah has built Al-Maut, whereas I have only constructed this minuscule paper castle. But I choose to believe that it will outlive Al-Maut. Nothing frightens me more than to think that upon my death, my manuscript could fall into careless or malevolent hands. In an almost offhand manner, he held the secret book out to Vartan. You may open it, since you will be its guardian. The disciple was moved. Would anyone else have had this privilege before me? Two people, Jahan, after a quarrel in Samarkand, and Hassan when we were living in the same room upon our arrival in Isfahan. You trusted him to that extent? To tell you the truth, I did not. However, I often wanted to write and he ended up noticing the manuscript. I preferred to show it to him myself since, anyhow, he could have read it behind my back. Moreover, I deemed him capable of keeping a secret. He really does know how to keep a secret, the better to use it against you. Henceforth, the manuscript would spend its night in Vartan's room. At the slightest noise, the former officer would be bolt upright, brandishing his sword, his ears pricked up. He would check every room in the house and then go out to make a round of the garden. Upon his return, he would not always be able to fall asleep again, and so would alight a lamp on his table and read a quatrain, which he would memorize, and then indefatigably go over it in his head to draw out its most profound meanings and to try and guess under what circumstances his master had been able to write it. At the end of a string of disturbed nights, an idea took shape in his thoughts which received Umar's hearty approval. to write the manuscript history in the margins of the Rubayat, and through this device the history of Khayyam himself, his childhood in Nishapur, his youth in Samarkand, his fame in Isfahan, his meetings with Abu Tahar, Jahan, Hassan, Nizam, and many others. Thus, it was under Khayyam's supervision, and sometimes with him dictating the words, that the first pages of the chronicle were written. Vartan threw himself into it, writing each phrase down 10 or 15 times on a loose sheet before transcribing it in a thin, angular, and laborious hand, which one day was brutally interrupted in the middle of a phrase. Umar had woken up early that morning. He called Vartan, who did not reply. Another night spent writing, Khayyam said to himself in a fatherly way. He let him rest a while longer, poured himself a morning drink, just a drop at the bottom of the glass, which he swallowed in one gulp, followed by a whole glassful, which he carried with him as he went for a walk in the garden. He walked around, diverting himself by blowing on the dew which was still on the flowers. Then he went off to gather some juicy white mulberries, which he placed on his tongue and squashed against his palate with every sip of wine. He was enjoying himself so much that a good hour had passed before he decided to go back in. It was time for Vartan to get up. He did not call him again, but went straight into his room to find him stretched out on the ground, his throat black with blood, his mouth and eyes open and set rigid, as if in a last suffocated cry. On his table between the lamp and the writing desk was the dagger with which the crime had been committed. It was planted in a curled up sheet of paper, which Umar unrolled to read, "Your manuscript has gone ahead of you to Al-Maut."